right. How's it going, Matt? How's it going, Lee?
Good.
Hey there.
Thanks for joining me. All right, so we are here to talk about what would have to be true for impact to be investable in Web3. Matt, maybe let's start with you.
Sure thing. I guess before I kick it off, I also want to kind of give a shout out to a few team members who have helped shape the thinking here. Evan Miyazono, who I think you already had on the GreenPilled podcast, and then Holka Brammer, who has been kind of instrumental in shaping our thinking here. And hopefully he has a chance to kind of voice his unique perspective as well. I guess to answer your question, I would start with more or less our high level thinking on, what needs to exist, or like what the world needs to look like for us to have sufficient capital to kind of like create like an investable or like a, sustainably fundable impact market. And I think for us, it's like breaking it down into, okay, I think one of the most important things is like you need a pool of value aligned capital at one end of the spectrum that is really kind of like funding in multiple ways that create the right incentive systems to actually like create the useful work that's being done. And this pool of capital needs to have, in some ways aligned incentives to be able to kind of like fund this. It needs to be sustainable in the sense that we can continue to reinvest and that we actually have like a, an ability to fund over a long time. A lot of these projects that are going to take many years to kind of like become coherent. And then also that kind of implies some measure of kind of value capture or value kind of like replenishment so that you can kind of, refill the pot of resources, funding, money, whatever you want to call it, in order to continue like funding these things and create that like funding pathway. On the other end, you need a supply of projects, people, organizations that are really allocating the resources that are available towards some of these kind of like important, regen projects that we call, examples of open source software, a lot of the great work that's being done in kind of like, carbon offsets, things like journalism. I think there's a lot of like, there's a need for more teams and like more having the smartest people of our time and like the most capable driven teams working on these projects. But for that to exist, you almost need capital and resources to be allocated from these pool of capitals or the pool of capital, pool of resources, and find the right teams. So that is productively allocating these resources to get the work done. And for that, I think there's this middle piece that in my mind is one of the most interesting parts, which is how do you get resources from A to B? And how do you solve like the distribution and infrastructure of being able to properly set up how funding gets from these pools of funding to the projects in a way that actually allows them to kind of like grow, test ideas, and sustainably fund the ideas they're working on. And I think that's a really interesting part to explore, especially with some of the latest work that's happening in kind of like the regen space, where I think we're starting to develop a lot more of the tools to create that allocation from these pools of capital all the way to the people who are doing, and more often seeing the incentives aligned for them to create large scale impact projects that align kind of like the work and the resources that we have in our economy towards the most important things in people's lives that are maybe underfunded right now. So I'll stop there. I'm curious about your perspective here, Lee, as well, and Kevin.
Yeah, same question to you, Lee. What would have to be true to connect more money to more impact?
Yeah, for sure. First of all, I would just like to say that I'm probably like the most noob person on this podcast insofar as, this is not where I spend like my full-time day job thinking about, but this is an area of inquiry that definitely tremendously interests me and I think is super critically important. I think in terms of the question of like what would need to be true to make impact investable, I think it's helpful to start with impact investing outside of crypto and examine that market as a whole and the funding landscape around it. So impact investing is this sector of investing where investors are seeking to generate a positive social or environmental impact in addition to just financial returns, which is, the classic type of investing that we have and which most capital allocators are seeking to maximize. And so that idea of having these like dual or three separate mandates, like beyond just financial profit maximization, but actually seeking to generate impacts outside of that, I think that gets to the crux of like what needs to be the case for impact to be investable. Traditionally, like in the investing world, most capital is seeking to generate profits. Like that is the motive that is motivating most capital allocators. And so I think in order to make impact investing, or to make this style of investing more attractive, more investable, what needs to happen is that that impact needs to be bundled in with the financial impact, or like with the primary KPI against which we are assessing companies or projects. I think to Matt's point about like the efficient market hypothesis, I think one critical missing piece in the world today is that there's market failures all around us. Markets are not efficient. There's many instances where supply and demand are not clearing at an optimal point from a societally optimal perspective. And those sources of market failure can include externalities that are not internalized, disproportionate market power on the part of certain market participants, information asymmetry, et cetera. There's lots of different reasons why markets would fail, and I think like the idea of impact being this separate thing from a financial motive is the reason why we don't have more impact investing today. It's because impact is the separate KPI versus financial outcomes, which is the very clearly measurable outcome. And so if we can somehow tie together impact into the financial metrics and optimize for that one single KPI, then I think that is the world in which we can optimize for these social impacts as a part of what we do every day.
Matt, did you want to respond to that?
I agree. And I think I think I'd maybe like try and, pull apart a few threads there about, maybe like one, what does being investable mean? And then two, what do we define as impact? And like start not to be too abstract, but I think it's helpful to frame that in terms of, like investable can mean different things to different kind of like bodies. And I think it's really like, where do I see a return by the resources that I'm putting out? And I think you can look at that at a few different layers. Like it's, from potentially more of like an investment focused perspective, and Lee, feel free to challenge me on this, but there's kind of like the VC mindset where there's a certain kind of return profile or kind of expectations when you are making an investment and the thesis behind that. And then I would maybe draw the corollary to something more so like government funding, where it's you have a value capture umbrella that is essentially kind of like is in its perfect state optimizing for kind of like the value or the kind of like continuance of society and like the generation of kind of like value for that entire kind of like nation state, for example. And then you can think of other things like DAOs or other funding entities that might have different kind of return profiles. Think of like nonprofits, stuff like that. So really, when when we say investing, maybe it's good to open it up to like there are different kind of motivations behind investing, and like the pool of capital and the projects need to kind of match in the sense of like they need to have the profile of return and value that is appropriate for the funder that is actually funding them. And I think that opens up a lot of interesting exploration about what type of entities need to exist to be able to fund the types of projects that we think are underfunded. The second thing I would say with impact is like maybe one way to think of that is in the term of like externalities, positive and negative, and whether or not something is kind of like internalized, like the value that is created is internalized, or the value that is created is actually an externality. It's not something that's immediately captured by the the entity that creates it, but is rather kind of externalized. So when you think of something like impact investing, I would throw a layer on of we're seeing a lot of projects that are actually generating a lot of like positive externalities, but don't necessarily capture that in a way that would be returnable in existing funding models. So I think it's a helpful frame of like, impact can mean a lot of different things to different people. But right now it's like, well, we see a lot of externalities that are created, but aren't necessarily captured by the existing kind of, capital markets, capitalist system. And maybe that's something that we can actually kind of change and improve, which we have started to see with things like ESG, despite, arguments against it.
Yeah, I think those are really, really great points. I think specifically honing in on this idea of like, what do we even mean by impact? Like there's lots of different types of impact. I think that is a really salient point. And I would point to the fact that, just that in recent decades, there are now so many companies that are voluntarily offsetting their carbon emissions as being, a type of impact investing that these corporations are doing. Like they are now cognizant of this type of impact that they have on the environment, in addition to the financial returns that they're delivering. And so that second source of like that second mandate that goes above and beyond the financial outcomes that they produce is a really interesting shift. And I think there's a lot of, we could, maybe explore like the reasons why that shifted and think about how that could apply to other types of impact as well. But I think that is like a really interesting microcosm of how do we move the world in a direction wherein players have a desire to care about more than just financial returns.
Yeah, I'd love to like dive into that one a little bit and understand your perspective as somebody who's coming from, dare I say, the VC perspective as well. I also am curious because, I think when you think of this idea, and maybe I'll layer on another, pitch over to you, is when we think of a lot of kind of public goods funding, there's, one way of saying that is like there's massive government and entities and NGOs who represent a big pool of capital that, they do invest in some elements of public goods. And we can, I would make the assertion that there's potentially a need for increased efficiency or productivity of some of like the resources that are allocated or like currently exist in that big pool. One of them being that, some of these big institutions are not, well suited to invest in innovation, high upside, high risk, which is typically something that is really well suited to VCs. And I would argue that there's a need for, in the public goods and impact space, the ability to like massively scale and invest and create the environment, the ecosystem for these high risk, high reward type public goods and impact projects to be able to be funded and scaled. So I guess I'll toss it over to you. Like for the first point, like what do you think has been changing, and like how have you seen that from your perspective in the VC lens?
Yeah. I think like an efficient market person would have a slightly, like, I think there's two possible explanations as to what's going on in the carbon markets with regards to carbon offsets and like that cultural shift in the way that corporations are behaving with voluntary carbon offsets. And so I'll lay them out both here. So one explanation could be the one that I alluded to earlier, which is that because climate change has now become such a major issue that everyone cares about, and that includes like the leaders of these companies. As a result of that, these corporations have just adopted this mandate of offsetting carbon emissions, and so they've like just kind of voluntarily created this mission of eliminating or offsetting a portion of their carbon offsets fully because of the desire to do so, because they believe that climate change is an important issue and that they want to play a part in it. And so it could just that's kind of like the intrinsic desire argument, and that's nice to believe because maybe corporations have like other missions and motives beyond just financial maximization of profits. And then I think the second explanation, which is more of like an efficient market explanation, could be that because climate change has become such a hot button issue on the part of consumers and now impacts the way that consumers direct their dollars and spend their money, and impacts the brands and companies that they choose to buy from, perhaps this is just another way of like that desire for profit maximization to express itself. That ultimately, by offsetting carbon, companies are actually just serving the financial profit maximization motive. And they can do so because offsetting carbon maximizes their sales. I'm not sure which one is the right explanation. Maybe there's probably a bit of both in play. But I mean, I can pause there, and I would love to hear your guys' thoughts as well.
Kevin, you've been quiet over there.
Yeah. Well, you guys are the experts, so let me know when you're ready to make a meme about this stuff and I'll chime in. But no, I was going to say, I think that with the carbon credits market, someone told me that 99% of carbon credits are consumed by people who have mandated
I
a
think I
carbon
mentioned
policy
that.
versus 1% is voluntary. And I'm wondering what would have to be true for more companies to voluntarily consume carbon credits, because it feels like that's a little bit more scalable. But yeah, Matt, I'm curious what you think of all this.
Yeah, well, I think it's a balance, and I think I really like Lee's point about, I guess like if I put on my kind of like realist or like the efficient market hat, in some ways, like it's if a company is responding to kind of like consumer desire to like direct their funding based off of like a kind of like more environmentally friendly mandate, I think it's like I don't think there's anything wrong with that if the end result is that people are investing more and like doing more to kind of offset like their carbon impact. And I think that's in some ways that's a way of consumers actually, you know, using their buying preference to, you know, reflect change that they want to see, which I think is like super powerful, and can like we can point that to a lot of different things that are happening, you know, with kind of like, you know, Web3 and the way that now Web3 is kind of creating DAOs and you know, investment pools to actually invest in the way that they actually want to see, and like, you know, propagate their preference for different like value systems in the existing you know, the existing economy. I think like with the regulation piece, it's like it comes back to, you know, what is the root cause of that? Is it that could also just be like people, you know, pushing through via their vote in you know, local politics, or like, you know, various like representatives that like we demand more kind of emphasis on these types of regulations that'll facilitate that. So I think like regulation is a powerful tool if it represents the kind of like the intentions of the people there. I don't want to go too much into politics, but I guess what I'm coming back to is like, I think it's super interesting that people are now, you know, whether assumed or like explicitly actually kind of thinking more about these values aligned kind of ways of kind of, you know, spending their dollars. And I guess I'd be curious, Lee, if you think, you know, one end is like the kind of like the purchasing perspective, but on like the investing perspective, I could see another world where people who are in a position where they're actually kind of like are able to reinvest their wealth on a level of like an LP. Are we seeing a shift in kind of the preferences of kind of like value attached to capital that has traditionally been like more so profit focused, or is it now kind of coming into more of like an ESG, or like a, you know, it has a values aligned flavor to it now?
So many thoughts here. So first, I'll respond to. I'll continue the conversation about carbon markets and carbon offsets first before answering the second part of the question, which is around like the shift in who gets to participate in investing, which I think is a really fascinating topic with lots of implications. So on the carbon market side, yeah, to your point, Kevin, I had been looking at the carbon offset market and realized that basically the size of the voluntary carbon offset market, which is basically one that is, as expected, one in which companies are like voluntarily offsetting carbon emissions versus having to be mandated by the government. The voluntary market is about 1% of the size of the overall carbon offset market, which is really fascinating. So obviously, most companies are offsetting carbon because they are regulatorily forced to do so. But the other way to look at that is, you know, why do those regulations exist? Why are companies being mandated to offset carbon emissions? Well, you know, in democratic governments, we have to assume that like those regulations reflect the will of the people, of consumers. And so that mechanism also does reflect a way to be consumer oriented and reflects how consumers want these companies to act and behave. And so there's lots of different ways for consumer preferences to evidence themselves and to make their voices heard. Regulation is maybe like, you know, this other path, and then directing where their dollars get spent is like a more direct path. But both are quite effective in this instance in shifting the behavior of these companies. So I think that's quite interesting. On the second topic about innovation, investing, etc., this is a topic that I've been thinking a lot about. You know, why is it the case that we have the startups that we have? Why is it the case that we even have the companies that we have in the world? If you look at like the biggest companies in the world, why are those the biggest companies? Why are these the startups being funded? It goes back to well, lots of things, but I think we can look at like the kind of birth moment of these startups as a very critical moment in which there's a ton of companies that get started. And then today, what happens, at least in the US, is that a very special class of firms and individuals who are accredited get to select which companies to deploy dollars into for seed investment. And so those are the companies that go on to survive. The companies that are then able to continue to raise funding or be profitable are the ones that continue to grow, and ultimately, go public or be successful, et cetera. And so that question of like, who gets to decide like which companies even get to exist is steering innovation in certain directions. And today that direction of innovation is being steered by people who are in the position of being capital allocators. They have been entrusted as money managers on behalf of large institutional funds, or they are individuals who possess a lot of wealth. In the US, you have to be an accredited or qualified purchaser in order to invest in startups. That means your net worth has to be over, I think, over $2 million or over $5 million, which is a higher bar. So obviously, this is not a representative set of people who are determining, which startups get funded. And that in turn has ripple effects on the types of companies that get backed and that get to exist. There's been all these memes and stories made about like, Silicon Valley VCs back yet another whatever bubble tea delivery startup. And it's like people make fun of it because it's like, this is solving such a niche first class problem. Why don't we go solve some other problems that apply to more people, and specifically problems that maybe like more mass consumers have? I think it all ties back to who is doing the funding, who gets to steer the innovation. And so that brings me to Web3. I think one of the most exciting elements of Web3 is that it democratizes the landscape of investing and makes it such that, in theory, anyone can participate in this investment process. They get to vote with their feet and with their dollars and get to participate in that funding process, maybe through pulling together their funds on chain into investment clubs or DAOs, or they get to get together with friends, decide which NFTs to purchase and which projects to fund. They get to steer treasuries like the Nouns DAO treasury, which is massive, into certain, different directions. And so the broader theme is when you get to change who does the investing, I think that has radical implications on the types of innovations and the types of impact that then gets funded.
So I think that's a very interesting point. And I think I agree on that. And I wonder, so there's this thread of Web3 creating a new, participation from like different investors that have like, different value alignments, or, let's say that are more like regen focused. And there's a broader question I have about like, so what needs to change to get to the point where we have, more regen investment allocated to like productive projects. And it's almost like there's the kind of creation of these, how do we get pools of capital or pools of resources that can be allocated, and then how do we allocate them in a way that best fits kind of like this regen thesis, and how do we keep on doing that in a long way? So it seems part of it is like, well, there's almost this like wealth generation effect that's happening in Web3 that is giving people with different kind of backgrounds or value sets the ability to now invest and, have an increasing share of voice on what gets funded and not. And then there's there's traditional pools of capital that are right now much, much more significant. Is there a way that we can kind of shift and put more of that values alignment in traditional pools of capital to actually get it to be more aligned with this regen thesis? For example, by introducing new incentive systems, introducing like secondary purchasers of things that are more impact focused, that have like a larger pool of capital, that would be able to kind of leverage the expertise, the investment and capital allocation expertise of this traditional kind of like group of investors, but do so in a way that aligns them more with kind of the, the impact thesis or the regen thesis.
Yeah, I think that is the question of the moment. Like I can say that, from speaking to hundreds, thousands of capital allocators, in my experience, most of them are concerned with profit maximization. Maybe there's a selection effect with the types of capital allocators that are talking to VCs, but most capital in the world are chasing returns.
Yeah.
And so if we want to shift more of those pools of capital towards regen projects, then I think there needs to be a way for that to be tied in, or there needs to be proof that that is ultimately going to drive financial returns. For that kind of impact to be internalized somehow.
Goldfinch is a decentralized credit protocol with a mission to connect the world's capital to the world's growth. Goldfinch focuses on real yields from real companies, so start lending your USDC to real businesses driving growth worldwide. Goldfinch's borrowers are proven fintechs and credit funds in emerging markets who need access to Goldfinch's capital to drive economic growth in regions faced with barriers to financial access. In just under 2 years, Goldfinch has loaned over 100 million USDC, reaching over 1 million people and businesses across 28 countries. Goldfinch is doing what DeFi was always meant to do, expanding financial access to those who have historically been shut out of the TradFi system. So, become a Goldfinch member to put your USDC to work, empowering real businesses' growth. Join Goldfinch's new member vaults to be an active investor and take part in supporting Goldfinch's security and expansion. Receive yield enhancements generated by protocol revenue, plus access exclusive communication channels and more. So go to goldfinch.finance to get started. Working in Web3 is awesome. It's freeing, powerful, and so much fun. But working outside of the typical W-2 employee structure is a deal breaker for so many people. OPOLIS is helping the self-sovereign worker focus on what they do best, their work, while OPOLIS manages the back end. There's a lot of nation-state overhead when working in Web3, and OPOLIS takes care of all of the back end stuff, freeing you up to do what you do best, your work. OPOLIS leverages group buying power through a community employment co-op, helping you save 20 to 50% on high-quality, affordable healthcare options through Cigna. So do what you love and maintain your financial security with OPOLIS. You must be authorized to work inside the United States to receive OPOLIS's benefits, but OPOLIS is expanding its services to Canada starting on June 1st of next year. So book a 30-minute free consultation with OPOLIS experts and join OPOLIS by December 31st to get 1,000 work and 1,000 bank tokens. Go to connect.opolis.co/bankless to get started. The world has woken up to refi, and CELO is here for it. CELO is the layer 1 for the regenerative finance movement. It's fast, planet positive, and built for the real world. CELO has committed to producing a sustainable future from day one and has built its technology around one of the lowest carbon impact consensus mechanisms, and is the world's first carbon negative EVM compatible layer 1 blockchain. CELO is a movement to create the conditions of prosperity for everyone, whether it's tokenizing carbon credits with Toucan, providing capital to underserved communities with Unicorn, or building for millions of users around the globe. CELO was created to transform crypto enthusiasts into a movement of change makers. Follow along on Twitter @CELO.org to learn more about how CELO is accelerating refi for a positive, lasting impact on people, communities, and the planet. And if you're a builder interested in refi, be sure to join the Build with CELO hackathon live now with a prize pool of over $100,000. COINSHIFT is a leading treasury management and infrastructure platform for DAOs and crypto businesses that need to manage their treasury operations. Every crypto org needs to manage its treasury, and COINSHIFT offers a simple, flexible, and efficient multi-chain treasury management platform built on top of the highly secure Gnosis Safe. With COINSHIFT, your organization can go from primitive single-chain treasury management to expressive, flexible, and multi-chain treasury features, such as global user management, global contacts, proposal management, and many other features that can be shared across an entire organization, allowing users to save time and reduce operational burdens and gas costs. COINSHIFT even has data tools like account reporting across the 7 chains on which it operates. Used by industry powerhouses such as Uniswap Grants, Balancer, Consensus, and Masari, COINSHIFT is speeding up the coordination and efficiency of the organizations that use it. You have to keep up with the frontier, and COINSHIFT makes that easy. So sign up at coinshift.xyz/bankless.
I wanted to sort of put in the pot and stir it that I am also connected to hundreds or thousands of capital allocators through my work on Gitcoin, which basically is a capital allocation mechanism, leverages quadratic funding. And so I have a sample bias that's in a different direction of people who want to fund public goods in the Web3 ecosystem. And one of the things that's cool about quadratic funding is that basically you have a matching pool that is allocated to a crowdfunding campaign according to the number of people that support each project, as opposed to the amount that goes into it. And that means that, you know, like Matt, if you raise $10 from 10 contributors and I raise $10 from one contributor, you get way more of the matching pool. So that's cool because it gets people off their bums to give $1 at a time because they can have $100 worth of impact per investment. And it pushes capital allocation away from central power brokers that do capital allocation into the edges of a network. And I think it's like a network model. Networks are much better at sensing and responding to conditions on the ground than top-down hierarchies. And I'm wondering if there's anything there with respect to how we allocate capital in a Web3 native way that's more democratized, and that helps us get away from the need to be tethered to only just profitable ventures, and more towards impact, and if so, how scalable that is. So that's my empirical experience from Gitcoin. And in reality, there'll be a plurality of capital allocations that all go to different audiences. But I think the network intelligence thesis is maybe one of the keys here.
Yeah. I was gonna throw another thing into the pot and stir it
Please
as
do.
well. Yeah, which is so I think this um, theme of how do we shift incentives, or how do we fund different types of impact or different types of innovation from what the market would perhaps choose of its own accord, um, is a really interesting one. And I think looking at the market for orphan drugs is
Mm,
potentially illuminating. So for those of you for those of you guys who aren't familiar with this particular topic, orphan drugs are essentially drugs that are developed to treat medical conditions that are so rare that they would basically not be researched or developed without government assistance. And so in the US, as well as I think in Europe, there's different programs that incentivize the R&D behind orphan drugs, such that people who suffer from these really rare conditions could still access drugs that they need. And I think there's some threshold of what classifies as an orphan drug. It's something like a condition that afflicts something like less than 200,000 people per year. So exceedingly rare. And so, under normal market circumstances, there's no way in which these drug companies would actually go ahead and proactively develop drugs to treat these orphan diseases. And so, the government intervenes in this case and basically creates all sorts of incentive programs, including marketing incentives, financial incentives, tax credits, to promote the development of these orphan drugs. And so I think it's really interesting because here there's not, a sufficient profit motive to get these corporations to act in a certain way. And so there's outside intervention by the government to change the incentives, to create a new profit motive where previously there wasn't a pre-existing profit motive around this specific type of impact.
Yeah, so if I can jump in, like this I think is hitting on something with like the incentive design problem that's like super compelling. And in this case, it's like it's a government or a nation state level entity that's like changing the incentive design, because I would argue that it is large enough that it has a value capture umbrella to be able to kind of realize the value of some of this, the creation of like these new products or projects. And they have the ability to kind of like subsidize that in some ways by creating, profit motive through, tax structures or like one-off grants, things like that. And I guess it's like, and Kevin, like, would love to get your perspective on this. One thing that's interesting to me is like you're seeing this thing in Web3 emerge where, and I'll say like, I'll scale it down to this thing, to an idea of like network goods versus public goods. The idea of network goods being something that is, not your traditional VC funded type project that has, the ability to like go through the traditional revenue model. It has like, it has revenue, it generates profits in and of itself because it captures enough the value that it creates. However, on a network level, it's actually like extremely important and is therefore subsidized by the ecosystem itself. So when the ecosystem, typically in the form of a token, has this value capture umbrella, it's actually able to invest and incentivize specific types of projects within itself that a typical VC wouldn't be able to do so. And I think it's super interesting because now you're seeing a lot of these ecosystems, creating pledges towards like public goods or network goods that grow, and like the resource allocation grows as a percentage of the value of the overall ecosystem. So it's creating this new ability for us to, set almost like ecosystem level regulations or ecosystem level incentives to build kind of public goods within those ecosystems. And I wonder how we can expand on that concept, because that almost has a corollary to, or like, comparable to like things like the nation states, which is, setting regulation
yeah.
in order to incentivize these important problems.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a post on the Gitcoin governance forums about a scalable, modular, pluralistic way of funding public goods, and I know that's a mouthful, but basically the idea is that if you look at the atomic unit of a holon, which is either a whole, it's a group of people that is a part of a group of other people, and like you can look at like Boulder, Colorado as a holon, the state of Colorado as a holon. You can look at the United States and then the world as a holon, and it's kind of holons all the way down. And then if you don't want to index on geography, you can index on digital ecosystems. So all of open source software is a holon. The Ethereum ecosystem is a holon. All of our bags in the Ethereum ecosystem depend on consensus clients and execution clients, which are their own set of holons. And then you have the L2 and NFT and DeFi ones. And so these are modules that if you can allocate funding to the public goods in each of those ecosystems, they all stack up and down. And again, I'll show quadratic funding here. What's really cool is that you can have a 50K NFT quadratic funding round, a 500K Ethereum quadratic funding round, a 100K Ethereum infrastructure quadratic funding round, and each of those might provide for $1 of matching, $5 or $1 of funding, $5 of matching, $100 worth of matching, $50 worth of matching. And so like each quadratic funding round at each holon level is like a fan, but all together they're like a jet engine that creates a huge like a scalable effect of funding public goods. And so it's about gathering all of those ecosystems together and creating a network effect that can accelerate the public goods that we all rely on. But the hard part is, where do you get that funding, and how do you build the collective intelligence mechanism of which public goods within those ecosystems people care about? And it's building that flywheel, I think, that is the hard part. But I guess if you take nothing away from my little rant here, it's that a holonic perspective, I think, is really key, because there is a pluriverse of public goods, and from the local level to the global level, and we have to be able to reason about a lot of them.
And maybe I'll throw another wrench in here, and I'm really curious about Lee's view on this. Is like, I think I would equate a lot of what you mentioned to like there's different levels of abstraction. Let's presume that there's like different there's increasingly large capital available at each of those to kind of like put against problems that they think they're important. One thing, if like, and this is kind of a qualitative assessment, is that one of the parts that's kind of limiting some of this refi or impact type resource allocation is the fact that it's very inefficient right now. There's a lot of difficulty in allocating large amounts of capital towards important impact projects. And the example I'll give is like, this is a very crude example, but like if you look at foundation or NGO spending, usually donations, there's a lot of overheads to actually allocate towards the impact that was created. And that impact doesn't necessarily always like get audited or like shown in terms of an ROI. So it's hard to create this like feedback loop of like, what was the effectiveness or the the efficiency of the capital I deployed towards impact, versus like a capital markets perspective, where we've had hundreds of years of capital markets development. The methodology, the infrastructure now exists to be able to kind of like efficiently allocate capital through that. So it's kind of the the old drunk person looking under a street lamp for their keys. They'll always look under the light because like it is the most measurable, it's the most like tractable. So I think one of the theses we have is just like, by increasing the effectiveness or the efficiency through like the development of infrastructure and tooling, some other things like quadratic voting, quadratic funding, and these different funding structures, we can actually increase the efficiency of capital allocation towards these important impact and like refi investments. And by lowering the transaction cost at each stage, it actually enables us to like open up these new markets for impact investing. So I'm curious, Lee, about what your perspective on that, and if you've seen, the parallels you would draw to like the infrastructure of the existing kind of like VC landscape.
It's definitely a really interesting question. I think, again, going back to the carbon markets, I think is perhaps illuminating, because I was speaking with a friend who's a founder of a company that helps other companies basically track and offset their carbon emissions. And he was remarking to me, we were sort of talking about the idea of impact certificates in impact markets. And his reaction was, oh, this sounds extremely messy and difficult to implement, because even in the world of carbon, which should be so straightforward. You plant a tree, you have offset so much carbon, or like this amount of CO2 equals like this much impact on climate change and temperature. Even with such a straightforward equation present in the carbon offset market, there has been such a wide variance in the types of solutions that are available for different corporations or people to purchase, with different corresponding levels of impact offered. There's high quality offsets, there's lower quality offsets, there's tons of lack of transparency in that market, as I understand it. And so even quantifying such a simple type of impact that should be so easily quantifiable has been tremendously challenging in the carbon markets. And so then if we take a step further and think about all of the different types of impacts and impact markets that we're trying to create, for instance, if we are trying to alleviate poverty or create new jobs or reduce childhood poverty, I don't know what it is. I can imagine that it is tremendously difficult to prove that impact was had, to trace like every step of that process, to figure out what the net impact of certain projects were, et cetera, to make that clearly investable. As an instance of this, I think there are so many examples that we can point to from the history of venture and startup funding, wherein we thought we were having a positive impact. We thought we were going to have a positive impact on the world. And ultimately, these technologies ended up having all sorts of other types of impacts, some negative, that no one ever anticipated. As an example, let's take the dating app market. I love to talk about dating apps, by the way. Dating apps are an instance in which, conceptually it's great. Like, let's increase serendipity in the world and make it such that it's easier for people to meet each other, to meet their significant other, their soulmate. That's great. However, the end impact that dating apps have had is, you can probably talk to all of your friends and learn about this, or maybe you've experienced it yourself, but it's changed human psychology and human behavior in all of these really complex ways that people never anticipated. And so has it increased happiness? Has it adversely impacted people's happiness with their partners? Has it impacted people's, positively, impacted people's chances of finding true love? What is true love? It's very difficult to measure this type of impact. And so these companies get started, they get funded, they end up being successful in market terms, and yet the actual impact that they end up having on society, it's very complicated and nuanced, and maybe even impossible to ascribe a specific value to.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, I guess, taking both those examples, because I think it's like, you're right, we're never going to know all of the externalities that are created by a project. I wonder if there's an imperfect solution argument here of, does an imperfect solution relative to baseline create positive progress? And I would be careful in distinguishing that about, if we need to believe that a system can be implemented and has no theoretical barriers to doing so, that can actually be beneficial and achieve the end state we want. So I think for something like, the carbon credit market, I think the idea that we can create a system that takes into account, environmental impact or value, by kind of measuring the types of environmental impact we have. Even if it's we're not going to capture every variable because it's a very non-linear type thing, but we can at least capture some of the terms. We can capture kind of the linear effects. And even, I don't know the exact statistics because I'm not a carbon credit market or expert, so I won't get into that. But from my understanding, the amount of resources that have been now deployed into the carbon credit markets has significantly increased due to the presence of the infrastructure that allows people to invest and put resources into it. How much of that is, actual kind of carbon offset, for example, versus derivatives built on top with an ESG flavor, that I'm not sure, and somebody will have to fact check me on. But I'd be curious to understand if kind of the net impact, understanding the noise, the signal noise of a lot of that is going to be misallocated.
Mm-hmm.
probably was a lot more misallocated at the beginning than it is now, and like we're slowly getting better. Is there a path to progress where we can deal with an imperfect system that is making progress relative to baseline, but needs to be kind of refined? Tooling needs to be built, infrastructure needs to be developed, methodology needs to be refined to get us to the point we need. That's kind of like the comparison what I would put out there for carbon markets is like, yes, it's imperfect. We believe that it can get better, and we're working to make it better. Does that necessitate like a worthwhile investment?
That resonates. Yeah. I'm very much of the opinion in that we should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think moving towards developing infrastructure such that different types of impact can be more transparently invested in and capital can be allocated towards those types of projects, I think it's a really worthwhile endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is some of the most important work happening out there, period, in the world. So I just also want to say that. I had another point, but I forgot it.
Well, let us know if it comes back to you, Lee. I think that we've been diverging for about 45 minutes at this point, and we only have 10 minutes left of recording, so we'll have to start converging. I think that I'll ask 2 final questions, and I'll start with the first one here. What excites you about this problem space, and what makes you tepid / a little bit reserved? And I think at the start we started with Matt, so maybe Lee, we'll start with you on this one.
Sure. I am just really fascinated by this question of how do we steer innovation in the world, and how do we innovate on problems and solutions that are going to have the most net positive impact on the greatest number of people. Right now, I think we live in one version of the world in which like incentives are structured in a certain way, and we have profit maximization as this like KPI, this North Star goal that we've all collectively decided to orient around. But I don't think that that's the only possible instance of the universe that we live in. I think there's many other possible worlds that we could live in where we collectively decide that other types of impact and other types of outcomes are really important to us, and we steer innovation in those directions. I definitely don't take it as a matter of course that the things that are getting started, the things that are getting funded right now, are the most societally optimal things out of like the total possible universe of all of the things that humans could be creating. And so, this entire problem space really, really fascinates me. And so I'm very interested in, how do we explore what those other universes look like and what other types of incentive structures we can create to guide innovation in other directions beyond just utilizing the market as its guide.
Thanks, Lee. Matt, what is one thing that makes you excited and one thing that makes you tepid?
I think what I'm excited about is, I think the structure, and I'll use Web3 to start. I think the structure of Web3 has forced us, because of the way that it draws light to allocation and resource, distribution problems that we're facing on a very small level, that have brought more awareness to these incentive design problems, to the fundamental questions about what is capitalism and what are markets. And that's led to both a willingness and an open dialogue, more so than from my understanding has happened before, about these types of fundamental problems, which has turned into community engagement. It's led to a lot of willingness of people to explore these ideas and push on it. And I think that has led to, but not just discussions we're having right now, but a lot of development and experimentation around how do we change some of these things that we thought were fixed, but can actually now be more malleable. So, what if we did resource allocation using a DAO instead of a government or an NGO or a foundation? What would that look like? How would we more effectively get closer to the bottom and get people to solve for the solution space that is more optimal globally versus what is more centrally dictated? And I think there's a lot of experiments, quadratic voting and the growth of Gitcoin has been fantastic. Optimism and the work that they're doing, some of the work with various things around impact certificates and the data layers that will kind of enable the infrastructure here I think is super exciting. And just it's all been brought around by this, this latest kind of focus on Web3, and it's bringing in others like values aligned investors and people from all over different fields, which is fascinating. The part that worries me is I think it's like this is not going to be solved in a year, and we need to kind of maintain momentum and through the ups and downs of the market in Web3, let's say, but more broadly, like we need dedicated efforts and support to do so over long term. And I worry that if we don't set up the right structure for people to think about this in the long term and work through these issues, kind of like we won't make the progress we need as fast as possible. And this this momentum in the Web3 space in particular might become like ossified before it can really reach its full potential, is something that I worry about. And like, what is the right way of doing it while pushing experimentation, while not overreaching and creating some like very negative externalities.
Thank you so much. Let's see. Last question. Where can people find you and your work online? Matthew, why don't we start with you?
Sure thing. The best way to, I think, read more about us and our work is by going to fundinthecommons.io. It's an event that we throw, with Shelling Point and a lot of our good collaborators from Gitcoin and the VC world. But we explore a lot of these topics, and there's a lot of good material that can help people get up to speed. I know Gitcoin also has done a really good intro to public goods, so you can find a lot of our latest experimentation Funding the Commons explained in video form.
Great. Lee, same question to you.
Most of my writing is at lee.substack.com, and Twitter is probably my most frequent channel. I'm LGen18 there. And if I can just add one more thing. Matt's comment sparked this just now in terms of what I'm tepid about in this general space. I think going back to what I was saying earlier about how changing who can be an investor changes what gets invested in. I think one thing that worries me, or a concern that I have, is that the people who are able to participate in these new funding systems are not representative at all of people at large, of society at large. And the types of goals that they hold may be not representative, or actually in conflict with many other people who are not participating right now. And so, the democratization of finance, of investing in innovation, I think that works well only when that system is available and accessible to all versus a select few. And so that definitely is one of my concerns about the space. And then I think another point is that I think we all collectively need to have a level of self-awareness and almost a framework for how we determine what is worthwhile and what types of impact we care about in the world to start with. There needs to be that philosophical grounding and knowledge about what we care about in this world and what we would like it to see in order to even start thinking about allocating capital in that direction. This was the topic of a recent post that I wrote about. It's called A Theory of Justice for Web3, and it's inspired by John Rawls's book, A Theory of Justice, in which he talks about, how should we even think about allocating resources in a society? Given that we have scarce goods and scarce resources, how do we think about distribution of scarcity? What is societally optimal? And so that then leads to an examination of the idea of fairness and justice, and what does fair look like? And so I think that's actually the starting point to this entire conversation. And I feel like people are skipping it and moving too quickly and jumping instead to this haphazard grasping at different types of impacts in a way that is not first rooted in that kind of self-reflective process.
Beautifully stated. Matt, did you want to respond to that before we break?
No, I think it's a great point. I would expand even further by, even in the systems and like the foundations that we're building right now, from like a thought perspective and just like a framework perspective, things like the protocols we're designing and the way that we're designing staking systems. The more people we can have from more diverse backgrounds, the more we need to like really solve for that early on, to understand like where our blind spots are, because like anything that we do introduces bias, and the longer we wait to like solve for having the full perspective of everybody that should be involved, the more things get set in stone. So not just like the funding, but also like the design, the conversations, like everything.
Yeah.
We shouldn't take anything to be like a kind of fundamental truth, and everything is like influenced by our bias.
I will say I feel an intense feeling stretched between the sort of IPCC's report on climate change saying we have 8 years to get to carbon neutrality, or 8 years to start really solving the problem, and that urgency versus setting up a long-term architecture. And I really feel stuck between those things. I'm sure listeners do also, but this is a sign that we're on to something really important. I think that we keep diverging and we keep exploring the space, but unfortunately our time has come to an end. So Matthew Lee, thank you for joining us, and we'll put links to your work in the show notes. And thank you again for joining.
Thank you so much for having us.